Hello everyone, how are you? A little bit shaken at the very least, but I hope you are all safe and sound. I'm Arith Härger, and today I'm going to talk about something I did not expect to do it. And I apologize to my patrons who always have a heads up on the upcoming videos. Well, this one is totally unexpected, so the lineup of the videos might have to be obviously rearranged and some subjects postponed. So also my apologies, of course, to everybody else waiting on specific subjects and the continuation of a couple of series in this channel, especially in relation to animism. Anyway, as most of you might be aware by now, on the 6th of January of 2021, Trump supporters, white supremacists, Qanon homegrown terrorists stormed the United States Capitol. A despicable, horrible, disgusting, outrageous act with no small amount of ignorance. My condolences to the United States citizens and also to democracy. And congratulations if your aim was to make things even worse. You have successfully fucked things right into the dirt, as the rest of the world watches in horror and is absolutely ashamed by such degrading, disgraceful and shameful acts led by a particular group of ignorant people. Extremism leads to irrationality, which in turn instigates violence against those who do not share those same extreme ideas. And sooner or later, this violence turns against the extremists themselves. The world, and the course of mankind, has covered some millennia, but history continues to repeat itself, unfortunately. But today, I'm here to talk about particular historical symbols that were seen tattooed on a specific person that took part in this sad, very sad event, which is Jacob Chansley, perhaps better known as Jake Angeli or Angeli, whatever, this individual right here. But it is curious to me to notice that there's been a tremendous coverage around this person to the point that we are almost forgetting what really happened this day and what should be done to prevent this from going any further or to happen again. Also, the heathen community has spoken because this person has specific religious symbols tattooed on him, which have been often characterized as hate symbols and linked to white supremacists and other hate groups. So the heathen community has spoken, rightly so, not only to clarify that such religious symbols are a cultural appropriation by these extreme groups, but also that heathenry has nothing to do with white supremacy. And indeed, people such as Jacob Chansley are a disgrace to the heathen community and every other neo-pagan that identifies with pre-Christian, Scandinavian, Old Norse spirituality. So these are not hate symbols originally, culturally and religiously speaking. They are not connected to anything remotely linked to hate, racism, xenophobia, bigotry in general. So today on this video, I will specifically address the symbols this pathetic excuse for a human being has tattooed on his body. But I will address all of this as I normally do, mostly from an historiographic point of view, as this channel is mainly about Scandinavian and Viking studies. I'm doing this video for everybody, obviously, but perhaps most importantly, I'm doing this video for two specific types of audience. To white supremacists who indeed appropriate specific symbols to express their extreme political views and end up giving a really, really bad reputation and destroying specific factors of a culture. And I firmly believe that education is of the utmost importance because these extreme groups are the product of ignorance. But I'm also doing this video for all of those who are not yet familiar with such symbols, and immediately identify these symbols as symbols of hate. So it's important to know a little bit of the background in here around all of this and the symbols and how these religious symbols were politicized. And perhaps now that I reflect on this, I'm also doing this video to the heathens and neo-pagans in general who are, such as myself, against racism. Those against racism have the best of intentions, but their approach on the fight against racism might not be the best one. So if you stay until the end, I'll have a message to deliver, which I think it will be important, at least to reflect upon. So we all may change our attitude, learn with our mistakes, and strive to build a better world with more acceptance and understanding. So stick until the end. And also, by the end of this video, I'll have for you recommended videos I have done where I have delved in more depth about each symbol and the religiosity of medieval Scandinavia. And of course, as always, I will leave such videos in links down below in the description of this video as well. And if by any chance, indeed, white supremacists are indeed watching this video, if you stay until the end, I know perfectly well your response to this, because it's always the same. You will either call me a liberal or a lefty, or you will call me a Jew or a liberal lefty Jew. You anti-Semitic twats really have no imagination. No, I am not Jewish. Sadly, I do not claim any ancestry linked to such brilliant and gifted people. But if you reach the end of this video, you white supremacist twats, even though I have just insulted you, I promise you, you will hopefully reflect upon a few points and change your conduct. And by the way, just before we really start this again, sorry, it's also important to understand that such symbology has more importance nowadays to modern neo-pagans than it ever had in the medieval Scandinavian past, when such symbols were indeed created and understood. Their real meaning was understood back then. There are many modern connotations that were added to these symbols, and nowadays such symbols are indeed far more important in religious terms than they ever were to the actual peoples who created these symbols and knew about their meaning. This doesn't mean they were not important in the past. Of course not. This only means that nowadays there is a greater emphasis on the symbols and a wider crowd whose personal spiritual and religious beliefs are intimately tied to these symbols. But just before we start, perhaps I should also spare a few words on another very important aspect. So this person has a headdress on him which unfortunately isn't getting the attention it deserves, because it's mistakenly being taken as just Viking horns, because the entire outfit is being linked to the tattoos he wears. Obviously, this is not a fake Viking hat. It is a sacred part of the culture of the peoples, from the groups of Native American tribes and First Nations peoples in North America. We commonly call the Sioux, but they call themselves the Tahota and the Lahota. The Oche Tishakovin, right? The people of the 7 council fires. So it's equally important to address this cultural appropriation and the disrespect of an important sacred cultural aspect of a people, which is being treated like, well, in fact, it's not being properly addressed at all. This symbol has a meaning, and it's losing its dignity by being misused and disrespected by this buffoon. But the fact that only the tattoos are having a bigger coverage, both by the media and by neo-pagans, truly worries me, because the tattoos are of a particular, let's say for now, European cultural background, and it is Europeans and people with European ancestry that are outraged by this. But they are not particularly outraged by the headdress because it belongs to another culture, not of their own. So I'm just going to say it. And as you guys say it, white and black, I'm not a native speaker of the English language, and I'm not from the United States either. But apparently it seems it's normal in there to address people by color and make those distinctions. But honestly, I don't feel comfortable doing that because that's not normal where I come from. But for the sake of understanding and trying to reach out to you, I'll use that same approach, that sort of language. So I'm just going to say it. When in this moment and the response to this event, you are white and only outraged by the misappropriation and disrespect of your white symbols and nothing else in this picture, you are no better than the person right there in this picture. Perhaps just slightly less awful, but no small amount of hypocrisy. You have, of course, the right to be angry about the tattoos, but also be angry about this, about the other important and sacred cultural aspects of other peoples. Now is the perfect time and opportunity to stand united against tyranny, against oppression, against violence, and overall, obviously, against ignorance. Speak for those who have lost their voices for a very, very long time. Get united. Speak out. Join forces, for goodness sake, I beg you. If you want to stand on the right side, you must also stand on the side of the native peoples who have been oppressed for far too long. And this sad and disgusting event that happened in the United States on the 6th of January 2021, let's not forget, unfortunately, it is the proof that tyranny and oppression that has fallen on many native peoples of the world since colonization is still very much alive. So don't be just angry about someone claiming the religious symbols of your ancestral culture. Be angry at someone who represents your shameful past, our shameful past of colonization, and is trying to bring it back again. It's not just your symbols that are being disrespected. This entire event isn't just an affront to democracy. This is an affront to freedom and the life of all living persons of the world. So please, do remember that. Now, finally, with no more delay, let's get started, please. As I've already demonstrated, the picture of a full man, whose name is Jacob Chansley, better known as Jake Angeli or Angeli, whatever, appeared in several news reports due to this eccentric appearance. So I take the opportunity to talk a little bit about the issue of the tattoos, the tattooed symbols, and linked to the studies of the Nordic Middle Ages and their political uses. The study of the Nordic Middle Ages had a pretty bad start in the field of history and other social human sciences, and that shadowy past hasn't quite lifted and dissipated, so we still have to deal with the remnants of past studies which were not really directed to the study of the past and the historical truth, but rather to try to reshape history to fit into political ideologies of the 19th century, or the necessity to find evidences that demonstrate, or rather that legitimized political ideologies and racial beliefs. The historical and philological studies and pseudosciences and early archaeology done by complete amateurs, which began during the 19th century, were largely motivated by the ideological impulses of a racial background. Now, please do pay close attention to what I'm about to say so as to avoid misinterpretations. The Nazis, contrary to what we often believe, they did not, in fact, consider the Germans of the modern period, of their own time, to be a superior race, but they did believe in the purity of race, which is different. The idea of a superior race comes before the Nazis and after the Nazis, when certain ideologies pick on the pseudo-studies and sciences towards different ethnicities that were done in the 19th century. The Nazis, on the other hand, admitted that they were the result of a mixture of peoples. However, they identified their culture with ancient Germanic peoples, and even though they considered themselves to be a mixture of peoples, they believed in the purity of race. So as such, they considered Scandinavia to be the very region where Germanic peoples remained pure. And as such, Scandinavia was seen by the Nazis as the place where their ancestral culture and race had been preserved in its purest form, which is why, to this day, many historians and archaeologists, especially from Scandinavia, still continue to reinforce the idea that Nordic countries throughout history have remained isolated from the rest of the world. And as such, these regions have long-standing and long-lasting customs shared by all the inhabitants, which isn't true at all. And I'll show you that on a future video I'll have for you, the first video of February. Nordic countries have been far from isolated, but that's for the future video. But it's important to understand that even in the fields of social and human sciences, we still have to deal with the remnants of political ideologies of the past that have shaped and reshaped and have created a completely alternative history that never existed. Now, returning to the Nazis, they saw Iceland as a kind of cradle of Germanic culture, the origins of the Germanic culture, since it is precisely in Iceland that the only surviving texts were composed that give us some ideas or a glimpse towards a pagan Germanic cultural past, but mostly, as you know it is related to Norse mythology. Now, as I have addressed before in this channel, we have a big and important problem here. The fact is that these texts, these literary sources, were composed by Christian authors, at least 200 years after Christianity was accepted as the official religion of Iceland, meaning Christianity was known to Scandinavians and Icelanders before they have been fully converted to the religion and before they accepted the religion as their official religion. So the written sources on Norse mythology, the surviving written sources, were composed by people not only culturally and geographically detached from the pagan past of their ancestors, but also religiously detached from the pagan past. The Nazis knew about this, and it didn't matter to them. It was covered up, and it's still being covered up by extreme far-right ideologies that use the same sources for their own political propaganda to extol the supposed culture of their pagan ancestors, when in fact a huge part of the literary sources were composed by Christians and not pagans. So the political propaganda using the late medieval Icelandic sources are far more interested in Christian religious ideologies rather than delving deeper to try to understand the remnants of the actual pagan mentality. All of these themes from literary sources, together with a whole series of visual and cultural elements found in archaeological, but also literary contexts, were all brought together to create an idealized Germanic past. And even today, it serves as a base, as the basis of identity for today's white supremacists to justify their superiority over others. So the same false historic past, which was created to support Nazi political ideologies, continues to be used today. As such, a myth of tall, beautiful, strong, and courageous Nordics was created, from a hard, cold and harsh background which made them stronger and therefore superior to all those who were born in warmer climates, thus being seen as perfect, pure, and therefore also superior. A beauty standard idealized in the very dark Nazi Germany, and today it is still reinforced by groups of white supremacists and neo-Nazis, because they see Scandinavians' false and alternative past as the actual historical past of their ancestors. So they use certain symbols of that cultural past for the representation of their political ideologies. So it's pure ignorance and not wanting to acknowledge the actual historical past and the truth. So this is basically white supremacy, and the belief that being white, Nordic white, is being superior. The idealized physical features of the Nordics of the past is a caricature that is now associated with the figure of the Viking, which is constantly being represented and portrayed in the exact same manner in pop culture, and is often associated with cold, rigid environments, because in the 19th century it was created the idea that cold climates produced more productive and stronger populations, while warmer climates produced softer, lazy, and weak people. And this is why many still believe that the Nordic peoples are superior due to this climatic issue. And that is also why even today many people refuse to accept that the actual Nordic peoples of the past had physical characteristics as diverse as anyone else. And that is precisely why new studies of Scandinavians' medieval past, especially in relation to the Viking period, have been showing that not all Scandinavians were tall, blonde, and blue-eyed, but rather with very, very different characteristics. But many people, and especially, sadly, also Scandinavian extreme traditionalists and of far-right ideologies, still refuse to accept that their own ancestors were so diverse, because they continue to cling on to the alternative history that the Nazis created. And we have another problem, finally. Adding to all of this, due to the fact that an alternative historical past was created, only focused on some cultural aspects that justified certain political ideologies, there is a great lack of contexts, dead ends, and unexplained situations, which caused several historical contexts and symbologies to be set aside. Then, due to the lack of content, especially of religious symbols, several other symbols were added quite recently, taken at random from different historical periods, and all placed in the same bag as being symbols of Germanic culture and or of the Vikings. Many symbols that are now used to represent the pre-Christian Nordic faith, most of them are either not Scandinavian or are not from the pre-Christian pagan past. Such is the case of the magical symbols, staves, and sigils from Iceland, produced during the 1800s, which have in fact a Judeo-Christian background. Like the case of the Vegvisir, right? Assumed to be Viking, or the case of the Sami labyrinth, often said to be Viking as well, but it's not even from a Germanic cultural background, but in fact Northern Finno-Ugric. Or the swastika, often wrongly named Filfot, as the name the Scandinavians called it, but it's in fact the name the Anglo-Saxons called it. And the swastika is one of the most widely spread symbols since prehistoric times, and was introduced in Scandinavia actually pretty late, and greatly spread thereafter by Christians since the late 10th century. And as you know it, later used by the Nazis, which did the exact same thing these white supremacists are doing, giving a bad reputation to ancient sacred symbols. And Thor's hammer, such as the one tattooed on this idiot's body. And this symbol is indeed from the Viking Age, like the Valknut, also tattooed. But isn't before that period, because Thor's hammer, Mjollnir, its configuration and its physical representation appears precisely as a religious response to Christianity. The physical representation of Thor's hammer doesn't exist before Scandinavians got in contact with Christianity during the Middle Ages. In fact, it wasn't even a Scandinavian thing, because the earliest representations of Thor's hammer, physical representations in archaeological contexts, are from a Saxon background, in response to the Christian crosses worn around the necks of their Frankish Christian neighbors, and was popularized, eventually reaching Scandinavia. So, having said what I've said previously, let's take a closer look at this character, and I'll give him that. It's impressive how only one single individual, just by standing there and showing himself, there are so many wrong things in there that obviously, certainly you could make a PhD thesis about it. Almost wants me to have him as my pet project, to re-educate him on all the symbology, paraphernalia, and the headdress and all. I mean, with such a headdress, what does he want to truly or specifically represent? So much ignorance. Just imagine if he also called himself a shaman. Wait, information coming in? Hold on. Oh, really? Oh, he did. Well, it seems he's a self-titled shaman. Of course he is. Just perfect. I'm afraid he's too far gone and the shadows of ignorance are too deep in him. But it is impressive, just by standing there without uttering a word, the amount of ignorance that emanates from this dim-witted oaf. Frightening. Anyway, why did our ancestors tattoo themselves in the first place? Superstition, protection, religion, devotion, and healing. People in the past tattooed themselves in honor, let's say, for instance, in honor to their gods, or to represent specific persons of the world we now take as animistic conceptions, in honor of their ancestors, for protection, for a variety of things, and a particular devotion towards an entity or power, and for healing purposes as well. Certainly not to look cool or badass. The tattoos of bricks, I can only imagine it's to honor the gods of construction sites and a show or a display of respect towards the sacrificed builders who die every year so that new structures can rise from the earth. Well, we notice here that this rare bird exhibits a mixture of Nordic symbols tattooed on the body and a headdress with horns. I am not going to explore in here the appropriation of Native American elements. I have already expressed the message I wanted previously. So I will proceed to the other symbology because we are dealing with the Nordic Middle Ages, right? So we have the Valknut, which appears on some 9th century rune stones and other monuments, but in fact the meaning of the symbol is completely unknown to us, and I have already mentioned this in other videos that I will put obviously down below in the description of this video and by the end of this video as well, so you can check for yourself. We also have a stylization of the cosmic tree Yggdrasil, which in the mythology presented in the Eddas, in the literary sources, the Eddas, the poetic Edda and the prose Edda, unites the 9 worlds that make up the cosmos. Although I do not agree with the translation of 9 worlds, but realms, and not just 9, but that will be for another video. Then we have Mjollnir, Thor's hammer. As I've said before, these symbols are more relevant today than in the past. All of these symbols have a vast recent history explored by supremacist and racist groups and associations. Symbols that began to gain more interest in a research society founded by Heinrich Himmler, but also by numerous racist groups and more recently by neo-pagans who try to recover the ancestral cultural and religious meanings of these symbols, trying to demonstrate that indeed these symbols really have nothing to do with racist and supremacist ideologies. But it is difficult because unfortunately these symbols are deeply rooted in far-right, fascist and extreme traditional politics and ideologies, precisely because the first researches and studies on these symbols turned them into symbols of hatred, to reinforce ideologies of extreme nationalism in the 19th century and throughout the first half of the 20th century, of course. So the vast majority of studies on these symbols until at least the 1970s still strongly reinforced racist and supremacist ideologies. That is why it has been very difficult to stop having this connotation, because these symbols are still very much rooted in a collective conscious that understands them as something negative, quite negative. Originally, in the Middle Ages, in the Nordic Middle Ages, they were not symbols of hatred, but sadly, contemporary studies on these symbols completely gave them other connotations, other meanings, very negative ones, and became intimately linked to the concepts and ideologies of white supremacy. And I repeat, these symbols were important and relevant in the past, but only in contemporary times they were widely spread by those who defend racist and supremacist ideologies. So that's how the world got to know these symbols first, through the negative propaganda of such groups. And now neo-pagans that are actually interested in the origins and meanings of these symbols are trying to reclaim the symbols and show that they are not, in fact, hate symbols. But it's hard to do that because the general public got to know firsthand about these symbols from a terrible and wrong point of view. So we should really make this clear. It is important to warn that these symbols have been used for political uses quite recently, which have nothing to do with the actual historical past. But it is also important to remember about the historical inconsistency related to these symbols. We do not really know the meaning that the people of the past gave to these symbols. We don't know how important they really were. We only find them in certain archaeological contexts, represented in monuments and artifacts, but we do not know the specific religious, spiritual, and even cultural significance because the human mind doesn't last. Valknut is a modern name precisely because the literary sources do not describe this symbol, nor has this symbol ever had any specific name related to it that has survived in literary, archaeological sources, and even in the living memory of traditional folklore. So we call it now Valknut, Valknuter. And indeed, it is a symbol that appears in the Viking period, not before and not after, and in a variety of different contexts. Then the stylization of the tree Yggdrasil is in fact a modern representation taking advantage of Celtic artistic elements. And then, finally, Thor's hammer, in turn, is the only one we know the name of it, Mjollnir, and related to a deity, Thor. But in Nordic medieval history, it is a recent physical representation created in response to what the Germanic peoples, namely the Saxons, observed in relation to the Christians who wore a symbol on their chest, around their neck, the cross, the Christian cross. And the Saxons also wanted to demonstrate a symbolism linked to their own religious sphere. And this symbol was really quite famous in the Nordic Middle Ages. in Nordic countries until it fell into oblivion for many centuries and returned eventually in the 19th century, but instead now related to extremist political ideologies. And this is where the problem resides. It's not just a misuse of these symbols by white supremacists and other racist and hate groups. Neo-pagans are also innocently and perhaps even unknowingly misusing the symbols, because in the fervent attempt to reclaim these symbols, both sides are missing the point. Both sides want to reclaim the symbols to demonstrate a specific ancestral background belonging to a specific people, and disregard not only the historical accuracy of the symbols, but also the fact that these are symbols that have been constantly under development throughout history. And they are not the product of a specific people, of a specific unique culture. People make use of a type of a language which indisputably marks these symbols as belonging to a specific people based on their genetic heritage. Such symbologies and meanings have changed from time to time and have been adopted, remade, reshaped, recreated, rearranged, and reutilized by several different peoples. Nowadays, with the various scientific fields and interdisciplinary work, it is scientifically established that the populations of the Scandinavian Middle Ages already consisted of very ethnically mixed individuals. In Scandinavia, in the Middle Ages, contact and genetic exchange with populations further south were already striking. It was already a reality since prehistoric times, let alone in the Middle Ages. And I will show you that the next month. Science breaks the idea that in the Nordic Middle Ages there had been some sort of a kind of golden age in which the Scandinavian spirit would have reached, by virtue of its racial purity, a state of perfection, which isn't true at all. This doesn't mean wanting to deny the profound differences between human groups, but to frame them in a more balanced and less ideologically aligned way, living up to their complexity and to the real historical truth. So in reality, these symbols, especially the one we now call Valknut and the hammer of Thor, Mjollnir, are from an era whose peoples who related to these symbols and knew their actual meaning were of different ethnic backgrounds, meaning that in turn these symbols do not belong to a pure race or just a superficial concept of ancestry. These symbols were important in the Middle Ages for many different people from different backgrounds, not only ethnically speaking, but also culturally. There were several exchanges of ideas, but also, let's say, exchanges of peoples, mixtures, genetic mixture, and many ethnic groups identified themselves with these symbols in the Nordic Middle Ages, the same way that Scandinavians of the past also identified themselves with symbols from other cultures. But that stays for that other video in the near future, in February. Therefore, when many people approach these topics, in fact, and perhaps even unknowingly, people do it not with a genuine interest in learning about history and the historical truth. In fact, what many people do is looking for the confirmation of their own prejudices. And this applies to both white supremacists and neo-pagans like myself against racism, who often have the impulse to cancel other people, instead of helping them to learn about the truth and understand the truth. Both sides try to seek confirmation for what they want to be true, and after that they build alternative histories that do not correspond to the truth. Both sides cancel people in this era we live in of the cancel culture, and only create more divisions and continue to establish little groups where only those who share the same beliefs are allowed. And then articles, studies, and people, scientists who seem to offer points of view different from theirs are automatically considered rubbish, absolute garbage, clowns, and people only like studies and only think scientists are good when they agree with what is presented. Otherwise, if there is no agreement and confirmation for what is wanted to be the truth, scientists, academics, scholars are then either called sellouts or with dubious intentions and backgrounds, which then fall into some conspiracy theory. This sort of behavior is understandable, and it is a very human attitude, but unhealthy, an attitude that must be corrected. The truth is not adaptable to what we want it to be, and we must understand that the world will not end if we discover that, after all, something we believe in is, in fact, actually false. The truth is liberating. So I stick to what I have said previously. Education is essential. It is of the utmost importance to fight ignorance in all forms. Knowledge and understanding is what brings people together. Please don't get me wrong. I am against racism, and I am against white supremacy and tyranny and oppression of all sorts. White supremacists are wrong, but those against racism who cancel immediately white supremacists are also having the wrong attitudes. If you cancel someone, if you show them that they do not belong, they will return to the place where they feel welcomed, where they feel wanted, and where they feel there is confirmation to their beliefs. It's not by canceling people that you win anything. The right approach is trying to educate and re-educate people with the truth and facts that demonstrate why the truth is the way it is. Canceling people is yet again the continuation of division. So when someone is against racism, the right approach is education, not sending people away that are not in line with your thoughts, even if you are in the right side. Show them your side, make them understand it, let them know and understand your side. Education is of the utmost importance, as I've said. When heathens and other neo-pagans in general are against racism, and when they see white supremacists misusing these symbols that we have previously spoken, and they say that we are going to retake our Nordic symbols, it means giving credit to the idea that these symbols belong to someone, and that someone has the right to use them because of their origins, a concept that is part of racism itself. In other words, they are creating dissociation, separating themselves from those who use these symbols to discriminate others, yet they still consider themselves a distinct and separate group that has more right than others to use these symbols because this is our culture. You understand what is implied here with this attitude? It's the reinforcement of certain racist ideas as well, unknowingly and unwillingly, and as innocent as it might be. Everyone needs to be educated on the truth, on the historical truth. And then comes understanding, and people get united and not continuously reinforcing separation, because ones have more right over something than others. The ancient symbols do not belong to anyone. They are not registered trademarks, and mainly they do not hold the rights of American citizens, or Scandinavians, or Latins, or Baltics, or whoever. Everyone has hundreds of thousands of ancestors they could identify themselves with. Some people simply decided to identify themselves only with the Norse, for whatever reason. These are symbols that fell into disuse centuries ago and were exhumed eventually in the 19th century and mixed with evil intentions. They are not symbols rooted in the collective consciousness of any modern people, due to the cultural conversion that occurred with Christianity and other such religious conceptions and ideas, which have eventually entered the European cultural world. Alright, my dear friends, I hope you have enjoyed this video. I hope it was useful and perhaps even a mind opener. I don't think I'm making any friends around here, am I? Well, honestly, I'm not here to make friends. I'm only here to try to reach the truth as much as possible, and obviously to share knowledge with you. I give to you, you give to me, and that's what matters, education. And it doesn't really matter what people think about me, good or bad, right or wrong, because I am the only one who truly knows my own person, so that's the only thing that matters. So once again, thank you so much for watching. See you on the next video. And as always, tack för idag. Thanks for today.